Nobody expected Drake to sound like this again. Not after the Kendrick-Lamar war. Not after Not Like Us turned into a global anthem. And definitely not after the entire internet watched one of the biggest artists in the world slowly become the punchline of his own story. But now, Drake is back. And this time, he doesn't sound hurt. He sounds cold. Because the leaked Iceman snippets don't feel like the old Drake anymore. This isn't the joking, meme-making, hit-chasing version of Drake fans have known for years. Nah, this sounds like somebody who sat alone for months replaying every betrayal, every tweet, every crowd chanting Kendrick's lyrics while the world laughed at him in real time. And now, he's finally talking back. Suddenly Drake is firing shots at Kendrick, throwing smoke toward Joe Budden, possibly even taking slick shots at LeBron James after Bron was caught vibing to Not Like Us in public. Think about that for a second. LeBron and Drake used to look untouchable together. Industry brothers. Courtside kings. Two giants moving like family. So what changed? And why does Drake suddenly sound like he trusts nobody anymore? What makes this even crazier is that fans are starting to realize this album might not just be a response. It might be revenge. Because hidden inside these leaks are bars about fake loyalty, public humiliation, religion, industry manipulation, and Drake finally admitting something nobody ever thought he would say out loud. That Kendrick may have made him understand exactly how Meek Mill felt after Back to Back. That line alone changes everything. For the first time in years, Drake doesn't sound untouchable. He sounds dangerous. And if Iceman really is Drake's villain arc, then the rap game might not be ready for what comes next. And maybe that's the part nobody saw coming. Because for years, Drake moved through the music industry like somebody who could never lose. Every beef, every controversy, every diss. Somehow he always walked away bigger, stronger, untouchable. Even when people hated him, they still streamed him. Even when critics called him soft, corny, emotional, calculated, Drake always found a way to stay on top. But this Kendrick situation? Nah, this one hit different. And you can hear it all over these Iceman leaks. See, most rap beefs eventually fade away. People argue online for a few weeks, Twitter picks a winner, memes go viral, and then everybody moves on to the next drama. But the Kendrick battle didn't end like that. It became culture. Everywhere Drake looked, there was another reminder that he lost control of the narrative. Clubs screaming, Not Like Us. NBA arenas playing Kendrick records. Celebrities dancing to Drake's humiliation in public. Even people who never cared about rap suddenly had opinions about Drake. That's the part people don't understand. This wasn't just music anymore. This became public embarrassment on a global level. And for somebody like Drake, somebody who spent over a decade carefully building the image of being the coolest guy in every room, that kind of humiliation changes you. That's why fans are paying attention to every single Iceman leak right now. Because Drake doesn't sound like he's trying to win people over anymore. He sounds like somebody replaying betrayal in his head over and over again. Especially when it comes to LeBron. Now let's be honest. The internet noticed that shift immediately. The second Drake started rapping about people switching sides and fake loyalty, everybody instantly connected it back to those viral clips of LeBron dancing to Kendrick's Not Like Us. And maybe to regular people that doesn't sound like a big deal. But in Drake's world, that moment probably felt personal. Because LeBron wasn't just another celebrity. That was supposed to be family. For years, Drake and LeBron represented power together. Courtside appearances, private parties, public support. They moved like two untouchable icons from different worlds. Drake shouted LeBron out constantly. LeBron played Drake records constantly. Their brands became connected in people's minds. So imagine sitting back and watching somebody you considered close publicly celebrate the song attached to your biggest humiliation. That changes something inside a person. And suddenly lines from Iceman start sounding way darker. Not emotional. Not heartbroken. Cold. Calculated. Almost like Drake reached a point where he stopped caring about being liked. And honestly, that version of Drake might be the scariest one. Because one thing people forget is that Drake has always been at his most dangerous when he feels cornered. Go back throughout his career. Every time people doubted him, he responded with aggression. Every time the internet tried to count him out, he came back bigger. But this time there's a difference. Back then, Drake still sounded confident. Now he sounds wounded. And wounded people move differently. That's why the Meek Mill comparison shocked so many fans. Because Drake basically admitting that Kendrick made him understand what Meek felt like? That's huge. That's one of the most honest things Drake has ever implied in his music. Remember, Drake spent years clowning Meek. Back to Back practically became the soundtrack to Meek Mill's public destruction. The memes were endless. The jokes never stopped. Drake looked unstoppable during that era. But now Drake finally knows what it feels like when the entire internet turns your humiliation into entertainment. That realization alone probably changed his entire mindset. And honestly, it explains the energy behind Iceman. Because this doesn't sound like somebody chasing radio hits anymore. This sounds like somebody trying to regain control. Even Joe Budden noticed it. And Joe has been one of the loudest voices criticizing Drake throughout this entire situation. One week, he says Drake still has it. The next week, he's calling the rollout corny. Then he flips again and says the Ice concept might actually be genius performance art. Even Joe sounds conflicted because deep down everybody sees the same thing. Drake is changing in real time. The funny, emotional, Instagram caption Drake? That version looks exhausted. Now fans are hearing darker production, colder bars, less singing, more resentment. And when those alleged many men influences started getting mentioned online, people really started paying attention. Because if Drake is intentionally channeling 50 Cent energy here, that says everything. Think about what many men represented for 50. Survival, paranoia, betrayal, turning pain into power. 50 Cent built an empire by convincing the world he survived everybody trying to destroy him. And now Drake appears to be stepping into that exact mindset after the Kendrick fallout. That's not accidental. Even the title Iceman feels intentional. Ice doesn't feel emotion. Ice doesn't trust people. Ice survives. And the more fans hear these leaks, the more it feels like Drake is slowly transforming into somebody colder than we've ever seen before. But here's where things get dangerous. Because the internet keeps treating this like entertainment while forgetting Drake is still Drake. People are laughing now, making memes now, calling Kendrick the undisputed winner now. But what happens if this humiliation actually pushed Drake into a completely different creative space? What happens if losing publicly made him more focused? Because history shows something interesting about artists who get embarrassed at the highest level. Sometimes they disappear after the humiliation. And sometimes they come back obsessed. Michael Jordan turned criticism into obsession. 50 Cent turned pain into dominance. Even Kanye at certain points turned public humiliation into creative fuel. Now people are wondering if Drake is entering that same phase. And the scary part? The leaks actually sound hungry. Not lazy. Not distracted. Hungry. Like somebody with something to prove. That's why fans keep replaying every snippet trying to decode who Drake's really targeting. Kendrick obviously sits at the center of all this, but there's also smoke aimed toward media personalities, industry people, fake friends, and celebrities who switched energy once Drake started losing. That paranoia is all over these records. And maybe Drake has a reason to feel that way. Because during the Kendrick battle, people who once acted neutral suddenly picked sides publicly. Artists stayed quiet. Industry figures moved carefully. Everybody watched the internet crown Kendrick while Drake became the villain of the story almost overnight. That kind of isolation changes your perspective fast. Especially when you're used to being the most supported person in the room. And now, Drake sounds like somebody keeping score. Every betrayal, every joke, every viral moment, all of it. Which brings us to the biggest question surrounding Iceman right now. Is Drake making a comeback album? Or is he making a revenge album? Because those are two completely different things. And judging by these leaks, this might be the first time in Drake's career where he genuinely sounds like he has nothing left to lose. Which is exactly why the entire rap world is suddenly paying attention again. And that right there, that's the exact moment the internet started getting nervous again. Because people spent months clowning Drake like the story was already over. Every timeline looked the same. Kendrick won. Drake lost. End of discussion. The memes were everywhere. Not Like Us became bigger than rap itself. It turned into a cultural event. Weddings were playing it. Sports arenas were playing it. DJs were replaying it every single night like it was some kind of victory anthem. And through all of that, Drake stayed mostly quiet. That silence confused people. Because this is the same Drake who normally responds immediately. The same Drake who used to troll people online, throw sneak disses, post cryptic captions, and remind everybody he was still the biggest artist in the world. But after Kendrick, something changed. He disappeared. And honestly, that might have been the smartest thing he could have done. Because while the internet was busy celebrating Kendrick's victory, Drake was somewhere watching everything. Every reaction. Every betrayal. Every celebrity suddenly acting different around him. And that's why these Iceman leaks feel so personal. This doesn't sound like a man trying to entertain people anymore. It sounds like somebody documenting emotional damage in real time. Especially when you really listen to the bars about loyalty. See, Drake has always rapped about fake friends and people switching sides. But before, it sounded more emotional. More bitter. More like somebody venting. Now, the energy feels colder. Like he's accepted the reality that loyalty in the industry might not even exist. And honestly, can you blame him? Look at how fast the culture flipped on him. 1 minute Drake was untouchable. The next minute people were treating him like the villain of hip-hop. Suddenly, everybody had jokes. Everybody had opinions. Everybody acted like they always secretly hated Drake. That kind of switch-up messes with your head. Especially when you spent years helping people win. That's another layer people keep ignoring. Drake spent over a decade feeding the industry hits. Features. Verses. Cosigns. He helped artists blow up. He gave careers attention. He dominated streaming for years. So from Drake's perspective, watching people celebrate his downfall probably felt like betrayal on a massive scale. And that's where Joe Budden enters this whole thing again. Because Joe represents a certain part of the internet that Drake clearly pays attention to more than people realize. Joe Budden has criticized Drake for years, but there's always been this weird tension between respect and resentment. Sometimes Joe sounds like Drake's biggest critic. Other times he sounds like he secretly admires Drake's ability to survive everything thrown at him. But during this Kendrick situation, Joe went all in. Podcast discussions. Jokes. Breakdowns. Criticism after criticism. And Drake definitely noticed. That's why fans think some of these Iceman lines are aimed directly at media personalities who helped amplify the narrative that Drake was finished. Because from Drake's perspective, it probably looked like everybody smelled blood in the water at the exact same time. And maybe they did. But here's the crazy part. The more people hear these leaks, the more they realize Drake might actually thrive in chaos. Because the tone of Iceman doesn't sound defeated. It sounds detached. Like Drake finally stopped caring about being accepted. And if you followed Drake's career closely, that's a dangerous shift. For years, one of Drake's biggest strengths was also one of his biggest weaknesses. He wanted everybody to love him. The women, the fans, the rappers, the athletes, the blogs, the critics. Drake wanted to dominate every room while still being liked inside it. But after Kendrick, that illusion shattered publicly. No matter how rich Drake is, no matter how successful he is, the Kendrick battle proved something painful. The internet can turn on anybody. And now Drake sounds like somebody who finally understands that. That's why the alleged religion bars hit people differently too. Fans noticed Drake talking about crosses, fake spirituality, and people pretending to be morally superior while secretly playing industry games behind the scenes. And whether those bars are aimed at Kendrick specifically or the culture in general, the message feels clear. Drake thinks people used morality as a weapon against him. That's what makes this entire Iceman era feel darker than previous Drake albums. This isn't just rap competition anymore. This feels psychological. Almost like Drake spent months questioning who was real around him and who was secretly waiting for him to fail. And honestly, The LeBron situation probably intensified that feeling. Because imagine already feeling isolated, then seeing one of your biggest public allies vibing publicly to the song that destroyed your image. People keep downplaying that moment, but celebrity friendships matter in Drake's world. Public perception matters. Optics matter. And seeing LeBron dance to Not Like Us probably told Drake everything he needed to know about where the culture stood. That's why fans keep calling Iceman a villain arc. Because villain arcs usually begin with betrayal. And right now, Drake sounds like somebody who genuinely feels betrayed by everybody. The industry, the media, the culture, even his own circle. But what makes this story even crazier is that some fans are starting to sympathize with him now. Not because they think Kendrick lost, but because people are finally seeing Drake as human again. For years, Drake looked too perfect, too calculated, too untouchable. Every move felt strategic. Every album broke records. Every controversy somehow turned into more success. Eventually, people stopped seeing him as a person and started seeing him as a machine. Until Kendrick cracked the image open. Now fans are hearing vulnerability in Drake's voice again. Not soft vulnerability. Dangerous vulnerability. The kind that creates obsession. And obsession creates moments. That's why some people believe Iceman could end up being Drake's most important album in years. Not because it'll outsell everything. Drake always sells. But because this might be the first project where he's creating from genuine emotional chaos instead of comfort. Comfort makes hits. Pain makes statements. And Iceman sounds like a statement. Even the production choices feel intentional. Darker samples. Slower pacing. Less polished energy. It almost feels like Drake wants listeners sitting inside his paranoia with him. Like he wants people to understand what it feels like when the world suddenly stops looking at you like the hero. Because make no mistake, Drake knows people enjoyed watching him fall. That's probably the hardest truth for him to accept. The internet didn't just support Kendrick. People celebrated Drake's humiliation. And once somebody experiences that level of public embarrassment, they usually react in one of two ways. They either break emotionally, or they become colder than ever before. Right now, it looks like Drake chose the second option. Which brings us to the part fans can't stop debating online. What if Kendrick accidentally created a more dangerous version of Drake? Because every major Drake era started after pressure. Take Care came from emotional chaos. If you're reading this, It's Too Late came from paranoia and aggression. Views came from isolation. Scorpion came from public scandal. But Iceman? This feels different. This feels like somebody rebuilding themselves after ego death. And if that's really what's happening here, then the rap game might not understand what kind of energy Drake is about to come back with. Because the scariest people in entertainment are usually the ones who feel like they've already lost everything publicly. And Drake? He sounds like somebody who has officially stopped fearing humiliation. Which means the next move could be dangerous for everybody involved. And that last thought, that's what's keeping the entire internet on edge right now. Because if Drake has really reached that point where humiliation doesn't scare him anymore, then the rules of this whole situation change completely. For months, the narrative has been simple. Kendrick delivered the knockout. Drake absorbed the damage. The culture crowned a winner. And everyone moved on like the story was finished. But Iceman doesn't sound like closure. It sounds like ignition. Because the deeper fans go into these leaks, the more one thing becomes obvious. This isn't a scattered response, and it's not emotional venting anymore. This is structured, controlled, intentional. Even the anger feels calculated, like Drake is choosing when to let it slip through the cracks and when to pull it back in. And that's where things get interesting. Because a broken Drake would have sounded messy. But this sounds focused. Almost like he's building something under the surface, while everyone is still laughing at the last chapter. And if that's true, then the biggest mistake people are making right now is assuming the story ended with Kendrick's victory moment. Because Drake doesn't operate like that. History shows us something important about him. Every time the industry thinks they've figured him out, he switches lanes. When they call him soft, he gets colder. When they call him emotional, he gets quieter. When they call him finished, he returns. with something that dominates the entire conversation again. And now, they've called him defeated. So the question becomes simple. What happens when Drake decides to answer that properly? That's why the Iceman concept is hitting so differently. It's not just a title. It feels like a transformation. Ice doesn't argue. Ice doesn't explain. Ice just forms pressure slowly until it becomes something unbreakable. And that metaphor fits the tone fans are hearing perfectly because there's no desperation in these leaks. There's no begging for validation. There's just direction. And direction means intent. Meanwhile, the rest of the industry is still reacting to the aftermath of the Kendrick moment like it was the final word. People are still analyzing who stood where, who laughed, who stayed silent, who picked sides too late. But Drake sounds like he's already moved past that phase mentally. Like he's no longer interested in explaining himself to anyone. Not Joe Budden. Not the blogs. Not the crowd. Not even the people he once considered close. And that shift alone changes everything. Because Drake being emotional is one thing. Drake being detached is another. Detached Drake doesn't chase approval. Detached Drake doesn't try to win sympathy. Detached Drake doesn't care about being liked in the moment. And that version, if it's real, is the one that turns albums into statements instead of playlists. That's why people keep circling back to the idea of villain arc. Not because Drake suddenly became evil, but because he stopped trying to stay the hero in everyone else's story. And when an artist stops playing the role people expect from them, the perception around them shifts instantly. Now everything he does will be interpreted differently. A bar about loyalty becomes a shot. A line about betrayal becomes a headline. A reference to the industry becomes a conspiracy theory. A subtle tone change becomes a full-blown narrative online. That's the stage Drake is walking into right now. And it's dangerous for both sides. Because once you reach this level of cultural tension, there's no neutral reaction anymore. Everything becomes either support or opposition. Every lyric becomes a puzzle piece. Every interview becomes a decoded message. Every silence becomes louder than words. And Drake knows that better than most. Which is why Iceman feels less like an album rollout and more like a controlled re-entry into a battlefield he never fully left. But here's the part people might be underestimating. If Drake really is building from this place, from humiliation, from anger, from isolation, then the end result might not look like revenge in the traditional sense. It might look like evolution. Because the most dangerous version of Drake isn't the loud one. It's the one who stops explaining himself entirely and lets the music do all the talking. And if that's where this is heading, then Kendrick didn't just win a battle. He might have unintentionally pushed Drake into a version of himself that's harder to read, harder to predict, and potentially harder to compete with in the long run. But that's the risk of cultural wars at this level. You don't just change narratives. You change people. And right now, Drake doesn't sound like someone trying to rewrite the past. He sounds like someone preparing for whatever comes after it. Because in his world, the story is never really over. It just changes form. And Iceman, if it delivers on the energy of these leaks, might be the moment that proves Drake was never out of the game. He was just recalibrating for a colder one.